Yes, would you ask Mr. Allen to come back, please? Thank you. All right, Mr. Allen, ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Good, thank you. Yes, Ms.
Thank
Grogan.
you. Mr. Allen, we were discussing Mr. Hoban just before the lunch adjournment. Mr. Hoban has said in his witness statement that he decided that he would endeavour to conduct site visits about once a month. And we've checked the records, and between his first visit on the 29th of August 2014 and his last visit on the 7th of July 2016, he did on average visit site once a month, albeit there was a gap in summer 2015, and we think another gap in 2016 as the job was nearing completion. So we've established that from the records. I'm interested in your recollection of events. Did Mr. Hoban ever say to you that he wished to visit site more frequently but was not able to do so at Grenfell?
No.
Did you ever form the view that Mr. Hoban needed to visit site more frequently?
No.
Did you ever check how often he was visiting site?
No.
Did you ever refer to Accolade to look?
I can't recall doing so.
Did Mr. Hoban ever say to you that he did not have the time to undertake comprehensive site visits at Grenfell Tower?
No.
Were you aware that he did not visit site between the 15th of May 2015 and the 17th of August 2015 because he was prioritising other projects that had recently been allocated to him?
I wasn't aware he didn't attend that time, and I wasn't aware that he was doing that because he was prioritising other projects.
So that didn't come up at any of your weekly or monthly chats with him at the time?
No.
Did you ever consider reassigning the Grenfell project to another surveyor after you had assigned it to Mr. Hoban?
I don't believe so.
Did he ever say to you that he did not have enough time to check the compliance of the documentation he was sent relating to the refurbishment?
No.
Mr. Hoban said that he resigned from RBKC because he had had enough and he was finding it impossible to do the job that he was trained to do. Were you aware at the time that Mr. Hoban felt this way?
Not that, but I could add wanted to retire, and so I didn't want him to retire because there was a shortage of building control officers. It's very difficult to get new people in of the sort of level of competence that you need. But if that was his wish, I was talking to him for over a couple of years because he did want to retire before that time. So I did, for example, there's a preparation for retirement course so he can get the best out of his retirement.
You say you knew he wanted to retire. Did you know the reason that was one of the reasons why that he was fed up?
No, he never explained. John was a very private person, so it's for if he wanted to retire. Obviously, I knew about his mother, but other than that, I wouldn't. Some people wish to speak about more personal things, but that's their personal life. And as a manager, you can't. You go as far as the person wants you to go into their personal life.
I'm now going to ask you about the means of escape group within RBKC Building Control. We know that there was a means of escape group that could be consulted by building control officers. And we heard from John Hoban that historically there was a fire regulations group that would deal with all Part B matters, but that this changed at some point prior to the restructuring in 2013. Is that correct?
I think it was a long way before that, actually. And I wouldn't say the other group. It was a group of, they called themselves, what did they call themselves? It was a group called BREG, which is Building Regulations Engineering Group. So I wouldn't say it was necessarily all Part B matters, but there was a group in existence that dealt with like mechanical type stuff.
Did it deal with fire safety in the context of building control?
It was a building control group, and they dealt with the mechanical engineering, emergency lighting, ventilation, that kind of stuff.
Do you know when the change took place?
I don't. I joined in 1996, and we was in another building away from the town hall at the time, so I can picture where they were, and I can remember some of the people in the team. I think it was. There would be a matter of record on this, but I know some of the people that was in the group, and I know them. I knew them through work, but I think it was the time that Terry Ward was the district surveyor. So that was the leader of building control before John Jackson.
So sometime before 20...
That would be my estimation, yeah.
Sorry, sometime before well before 2013.
Yeah, I would probably say around the millennium, I would say, but I haven't got it clear in my head at the moment.
In 2012, the means of escape group comprised Paul Hansen and Dave Gammon. Is that right?
Yeah, there was, as I mentioned, there was a time when Celia Burt was being trained to help with that group with the view, I think that was for succession reasons. That was what I was looking for earlier.
Was she a trained fire engineer?
No.
After the restructuring, is it correct that the means of escape group was only Paul Hansen?
I believe so, yeah.
He was a qualified fire engineer, wasn't he?
I'm not actually sure, to be honest with you. I know he did do some of the parts of his qualification before, I believe, I was the building control manager, so you might need to check that, but he was dealing with fire engineering matters.
Was he full-time?
Yes.
Is it correct that he also worked on projects for other boroughs, so it wasn't exclusively RBKC work?
Yeah, but he's full-time for RBKC. What I would say is, just to expand a little, it's quite unusual to have a specialist group in building control. Most local authorities in the country wouldn't have a specialist to consult. Some London boroughs do, including that Breg group that I was talking about earlier. So clearly with a smaller team, that role still needs to justify, both by workload and income, its position. So with the ebbs and flows of work that was coming in and larger projects, we would offer this facility to other building control departments to check their projects to fill those gaps and justify the role.
So the work for other building control bodies was a bit of a money maker.
Not necessarily money maker, it might be more just occupying that role and utilising it. We wouldn't want to make a loss on it, but we weren't probably that detailed about it. But it was about generating income for the service, but not to justify the role as well. So then we had the benefit of someone like Paul.
And he was expected to do that work outside of his contractual hours, was he?
No,
Within
that's
his
all
contractual hours?
contractual, fully. And over the years, the surveyors didn't have to use Paul. If they did, obviously he would help give advice on B1 and B5 matters. As you know, B1 is means of escape and B5 is access for firefighting and the like. And there were times, and it's minuted in team meetings, where I asked that minor inquiries come to me or Jose, because Paul had a lot of that time, a lot of larger projects in. And sometimes with the workflow on those larger projects, it might be that he's made a lot of, put a lot of points out, but then suddenly all the amendments come in one time to review. So it's a case of like managing that workflow.
Were you his line manager?
Yes. They all direct, when I took over, I had all direct reports. There was no line. It was me and all the others, so it was very flat.
Is there a reason why the resource of a qualified fire engineer was not used more widely, for example, for B4 issues as well?
Well, it was fully used on B1 and B5. There is some history. It was mainly around the consultation with the fire authority. You're probably aware there's a standard form that's used between the LDSA and the London Fire Authority, and that only relates to B1 and B5. There may be some history why there was a separation further back than that, but I'm not aware of it. But to my knowledge, it was always B1 and B5, although it's like complicated things. There are sometimes other aspects that cross over. So, for example, if you're dealing with means of escape, there may be issues to do with ventilation or fire dampers across the means of escape route, and that could arguably cross into, say, B3 or B2.
So the answer there is that you don't know why he wouldn't be used for B2?
No, I do know why, because he was fully utilised for B1 and B5, and that was his role, and that was his area of expertise, and he didn't necessarily have expertise in those other areas.
So he was at capacity just doing B1
Capacity,
and B5?
and that was his area of expertise, not in B2, B3 and B4. He didn't have experience in that.
If we could go to RBK 3036051. This is a job description for a senior building control surveyor, brackets fire regulations. I've given you the wrong reference there. Can we start with 36050 first of all? So this is the email accompanying it. If we zoom in, it's from you to Paul Hanson, dated 19th of May 2015. Paul, first draft attached of revised job description for your post. I've incorporated the information you sent to me. And then you say you will forward it for evaluation. And if we could now go to 36051, that was the attachment. It says that the purpose of the job is to provide expert technical advice to clients and building control staff on fire-related regulations, to provide advice to clients on major projects utilising fire engineering techniques. And if we go on to page 2, so this is under the main responsibilities section, we see there, top bullet, to generally advise and assist building control surveyors in respect to fire safety matters, and one below, to keep aware of and investigate new products, systems and methods and formulate policies for them. Was the idea that Mr. Hanson's role would be expanded to cover all aspects of Part B at this time? Why were you revising Mr. Hanson's job description in May 2015?
It's not necessarily Mr. Hanson's job description, it's the job description that is for the post, clearly. And the purpose of it was to seek to get a pay rise for Paul Hanson. He was doing work of a level and complexity that was above the remuneration that he was receiving. And I wanted to reward him for what he was doing and also then retain him. In the industry, he could earn a lot more than he was doing working for us, and he was underpaid.
If we just go back to the first page, and I'll just let you look at that to yourself, and if you just let me know when you finish reading that, and then
I'd have to
zoom in a bit.
Yeah, colleague over here will zoom it in, but I can't read it at the moment. Yep.
And just onto the next page, so you can finish reading.
Yep.
So it doesn't say there that the role is limited to giving advice on B1 and B5.
Correct.
Was it the intention that he was to be giving advice on more than B1 and B5 after this?
Not
change?
other than I said previously, in relation to, it mentioned here, smoke vents and matters to do with like smoke dampers insofar as they relate to B1 and B5.
Why in particular did the role include keeping aware of new products and systems?
Partly to make sure that the role fitted the pay grade that I was seeking to pay him at, and also because it did reflect some of the work that he was doing in relation to more than probably smoke venting and things like that, but some of the work he was doing. It doesn't mean from that he's given advice on every single fire-related product to building control, and he was the source for that, and I can't think of many situations at all where he'd have actually done that.
So it wasn't the intention that Paul Hanson would be used as a resource if a product was being proposed on any project, that he would check it? Was his role ultimately amended to reflect this job description?
I believe so. We did manage to secure the pay rise, which was good.
Do you agree that it was a failure on the part of RBKC not to have used the resource of a qualified fire engineer for the benefit of the building control department as a whole?
The way you phrased the question, I agree that we had an expert in the department and we used him appropriately on the projects that he worked on.
Do you agree that the working relationship between the means of escape group and the other parts of the building control department were undefined and unclear to those involved?
No.
And do you agree that this way of working did not necessarily support project surveyors reaching the most appropriate decisions in relation to Part B, Schedule 1 of the building regulations?
Well, I don't agree with the question. I agree that part of the question in relation to B1 and B5 and those other aspects that I mentioned, They did help surveyors do that, but clearly his role, well, to me, the role wasn't for B2, B3 and B4. So he wasn't there to support them for that.
And was it the case that B2, B3 and B4 were less complicated or difficult to understand so that you felt you could entrust them to surveyors to implement on their own?
No, I think it's more to do just with the history of that group to start with, and it could have been, with time, it may have evolved differently. And as I mentioned at the start, I've worked in 3 different authorities, and 2 of those had a means of escape group on the same basis as this. I joined another one that didn't have one, and then I was then the expert for means of escape. And then when I went back to the authority I worked at before, they then lost the means of escape group. So it was back for the surveyors to do it. So it'd be a very small percentage of building control offices in the country that would have a specialist means of escape in-house. I would say, probably 5% max, I would say.
If we could now go to RBK 59350. So this is an email from Paul Hanson to you, dated 31st of December 2013. And it says, "Hi John, re-fire doors claims. I've attached no BSI doc which goes through some of the misleading claims manufacturers sometimes make. Although it is pre-EN standards, it is still relevant. Please circulate if you feel it is useful to surveyors." Can you recall why he sent that to you at the time?
It was a culture in the department to share information with colleagues.
Did you circulate it on to other surveyors?
You'd need to check. I may have done. I have since, and I may have, obviously I would have seen the document at the time. I believe as part of the evidence, I think you may have shown it previously. It's more for lay people, this document, than building control staff. We're used to people that aren't specialists using the incorrect terms. They use words like fireproof and things like this, which doesn't mean anything. And that's what the purpose of it was. But it's more to kind of general public awareness, and sometimes manufacturers may use the wrong terms because they're just through ignorance. So it really wasn't aimed at building control, but I would, knowing how I work, I would say I would have circulated it, but I'm sure you could find an email trail for it.
If we go to the guide, it's RBK 59351, and we see it there. Do you read that document in December 2013 when it was sent to you?
Probably, and I've read it since. I did see it in some of the evidence that appeared.
So when you say you read it since, it must have been you read it over the weekend after seeing Mr. Hoban's evidence?
Yeah, I think it was produced. I can't recall. It's all getting a bit of a blur, but I did read it at some point.
If we go to page 2, please. The column on the right, if we zoom in on the interlocking cladding paragraph. So there it says, under the heading interlocking cladding, it states a claim, it's fireproof grade naught, and then goes on to explain what national class naught means. Were you aware of confusion in the industry around what national class naught actually meant at the time?
Well, as an example, not wishing to be patronising, in the industry it's known as Class O, as an example. And I know in the inquiry we refer to it as Class naught, so that would be an example why this document's important. It's exactly because of that, because people use terms incorrectly.
So you were aware at the time of a confusion around what
within,
this meant?
Within lay people. It's not really for building control would know. This is the whole point of people trying, industry and people trying to justify something. As I use the example of fireproof.
So are you saying there was no confusion within the building control
Correct.
professionals about what?
Correct. Which is why things like fire stop and cavity barriers is clear for building control people. It's in there. And fire resistance and external, spread of flame and these kind of things are clear terms, whereas the term here is something that manufacturers or lay people use.
What about in the construction industry? So construction professionals, were they confused? Did you experience that?
That's a big question, and we're talking of thousands of people that I would have dealt with. So there's some really good people in construction. Top builders, some really good people, but there's really some bad people even with top builders. So there's a whole cross section.
So some confusion sometimes depending on...
Well, there would be, yeah, clearly, yeah.
Can we now go to INQ 30140085? Now, I expect you'll have seen this before if you were paying close attention to Mr. Hoban's evidence. This is a blog post from LABC website dated 15th of March 2017 titled What's the Difference Between Fireproof and Fire Resistant? Did you see that blog post at the time?
Not probably at the time.
The first paragraph there, if we zoom in on the text, says it refers to the flaming liability document that we've just discussed.
Yeah.
And then the second paragraph, terminology plays an important role in our industry. However, the misuse of common phrases can lead to a complete misunderstanding regarding the suitability of products for a particular application and could result in fatal consequences.
Yeah.
If we go over the page, we then see that it goes on to explain the difference between fireproof, fire retardant, and FR. And under the heading FR, it says, this is something used particularly by architects and building control surveyors as shorthand to mean fire resisting. It's acceptable provided all parties understand that FR means fire resisting to the relevant test. Although the manufacturer, specifier and installer each have a responsibility to ensure the correct product is used for the correct application, it commonly falls to building control surveyor to spot that the wrong product is being used for the wrong application. Do you agree with that?
It's what I was saying earlier about the function. One of the things is to check to make sure you look at the building regulations, work out what particular properties or function materials got to be used, and make sure it's exactly that test that the product data or the product and the test certificate. But that's all outlined in Regulation 7 about fitness of materials. It gives a whole sequence of acceptability of products and then also of workmanship.
Yes, and
So
it's also...
in Regulation 7, it just runs through all of that. It says you could use past experience in there. It says, well, if you know the products as well. So that's laid out in the regulation.
and you would agree it's also referred to in ADB that you need to interrogate products and materials.
As I said, yeah, I agree.
Now, so this blog post didn't tell you anything you didn't already know at the time.
No, but you
Is that
definitely
right?
see where it was circulated. The blog post it was probably meant for the LABC who I've worked for the last 2 years. That would be for the industry and for, residents and clients, householders and those kind of people.
I'm going to ask my question again. Your evidence is that this blog post didn't, not that you saw it at the time, but it's not saying anything that you didn't know at the time, is it?
Correct.
And if we just go over the next page to the last 3 paragraphs, it says right at the top, if the test standard is for something different to that claimed, then the product is not suitable for the intended application. If a term is used such as FR, fire retardant, or fireproof that are not defined by a test, be very suspicious. So almost 30 years on, the sentiment of the BSI leaflet remains just as relevant. Don't be a flaming liability. Frequently falls to the last link in the chain, the building control surveyor, to spot the problem. However, this just confirms the valuable contribution that a diligent surveyor can bring to the design and construction team. So we can take it then, based on your evidence, that you knew that as at December 2013, BCOs should not take manufacturers' claims about fire performance at face value.
Correct.
Mr. Hoban had never done a residential high-rise before, we know that. He'd never done a high-rise rain screen project before. How did you feel comfortable with him making assessments about product information and compliance of products with the building regulations at the time?
It's a long question. The start of it, you said he's never done a high-rise residential before.
A residential high-rise project before.
Yeah, well, he has done high-rise residential. What do you regard as high-rise? What's the definition?
I may have mis-summarised his evidence.
Yeah.
He'd never done a high-rise rain screen project before.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, okay.
That's not controversial. Thinking about Mr. Hoban specifically, so not building control surveyors generally,
Yes.
What gave you confidence that he was able to interrogate manufacturers' information to the requisite level of skill and care?
Because he's the senior building control surveyor, I had every faith and confidence in his ability. It's a core function to first of all look in the building regulations and work out what is the requirement that applies in the particular circumstance, and then looking up the data and making sure that element of it is as the building regulations in whatever certificate you're looking at. And it's outlined as well in Regulation 7. You know, it's a standard part of building control life.
Can you explain then how it is that Celotex ended up on this building?
I don't know at all what the reference. I mean, it's quite a wide question that you're saying. So, how? I mean, that's a very complicated question that you've asked. It's simple as I wouldn't know how the Celotex has come to be on the building. I mean, going through it, so presumably a builder's put it there that's responsible for, so the people carrying out the work, the builder and architect, the responsibility for compliance. The first stage is they need to make sure that it complies with the building regulations.
Perhaps I can put my question a different way.
It's quite vague.
How is it that Mr. Hoban did not, as you said at the beginning of your evidence, go back and say to the design team and Ryden, this insulation doesn't comply with 12.7 of ADB? Can you account for how that happened?
Well, I can't, other than what we've already said. It's for the building control officer to work out the requirements of the building regulations, and then if he's been given the information, and I've been trying to follow the previous hearings, so if he's been given the information about what product's going to be used, and then he's had the test data, then he should be checking that. So I don't know when was he given the information?
If Mr. Hoban's evidence was that he looked up information about Celotex online, and I can go to the two documents we think he may have seen, although he was unable to help us with whether he did in fact see them. The first one is CEL 6010. This is the LABC registered system detail for RS 5000 PIR insulation board. And you'll see at the top there it says PIR insulation board brackets rain screen application, and then there's an asterisk that leads to the words with limitation at the bottom. If you had been the building control surveyor looking at this, would you have gone on to investigate what those limitations were?
Well, this is a registered system, first of all. I'd probably seen as well if there is a actual test certificate for the product as well.
And had you seen a test certificate, would you have looked to make sure that the context in which the insulation was being constructed matched what had been tested?
As we said before, absolutely, yeah.
Can you account for why Mr. Hoban did not do that?
I can't. I know you've asked him.
Do you accept that that's a failure of supervision on your part?
The supervision I carried out, and I could talk about my experience both when I was a special projects manager or at any time. It's very much about it's just a single building control surveyor would be inspecting the works on site and checking the plans. It's not usual in any place I've worked to have a second check or somebody like going out in twos or checking the plans. That's not usual. And that's the case still today as far as I understand it, but I know you have experts that could ask that of building control. There are some that now do a second check, but it wasn't the place when I was being managed and when I was managing.
Mr. Allen, the evidence you've given is that you think this is all very clear and it's something that you were certainly aware of and
Yes.
knowledgeable about at the time. Can you explain why Mr. Hoban, whose training you were in part responsible for, was not aware of any of these things?
Well, so I was part responsible for his training. I didn't have that in my job description about training the staff as far as I remember, but as we've spoken about training at length, the surveyors were responsible for their project. And I had every confidence in their ability. If they had any doubts, they was doing something new, hadn't done it, were unsure, then they could ask me. I may not have known the answer to all the questions they come with, but if I didn't know, I knew a lot of people that I could ask that may know, including around London and nationally, or as I did, I would contact the CLG, the Building Regulations Division, which I had the names of all the the people there for the different parts of the regulations to ask them for their interpretation. And that's how, because people can't know every single thing.
Could we go to the next Celotex document, which is CEL, it's 5 zeros. Sorry, just finding the reference. Six, 5 zeros, 412. So this is the product data sheet for Celotex RS5000. Just out of interest, had you ever had cause to look at this data sheet in your work between 2013 and 2016?
I may have done. I can't recall what I saw then and what I know now. It all blurs in, so probably.
If we zoom in on the first paragraph, it says Celotex RS5000 is our premium performance PIR solution for use in rain screen cladding systems, developed specifically to enhance the thermal performance. And it goes on there to say that it is the first PIR insulation board to meet the performance criteria in BR 135 for insulated rain screen cladding systems, and therefore is acceptable for use in buildings above 18 metres in height. Had you read that at the time, would you have gone on to ask yourself, I wonder what system has been tested, I should check that it matches?
Of course.
And Mr. Hoban's evidence is that he did not do that. And again, is that not a failure on your part to make sure that he was competent to be able to scrutinise documents like this?
Well, the answer is the level of supervision there. In my experience, we've never had accompanied visits. I was there as a resource. I would have monthly meetings, at times weekly meetings, and I'll be there to help them. And the system in place, both in our procedures for dealing with full plans applications, which I think you mentioned in previous evidence, the procedure we have wasn't for a second check or sign-off, and that was the procedure that I was following, and also followed when I was being managed before I was the building control manager.
Mr. Hoban also didn't interrogate the claims on the BBA certificate in respect of the ACM panels. You were his line manager. Do you accept that you failed to ensure that he was sufficiently aware of the need to check the test evidence in respect of all materials used on Grenfell Tower's cladding system?
Well, as I said, the first thing is for the building control officer to check the requirements of the building regulations, in Part B in this case, and then to check whatever the product is against their test certificate and make sure that's the case.
Did you even know what materials were being used in the cladding on Grenfell at the time?
At the time, I didn't know the detail of the project because I wasn't responsible in dealing with that project, apart from the period when I was looking at the pre-application meeting. And as I said, there wasn't a process at the time of second checking.
So you didn't know it was ACM?
I wouldn't have known.
You didn't know it was Celotex?
I wouldn't have known.
You wouldn't or you didn't?
I don't think I knew. I didn't have a recollection of knowing because I wouldn't check the detail. I wouldn't have checked the plans on the Grenfell projects. It wasn't the project that I was looking after at that time.
Okay. But you would obviously have expected Mr. Hoban to check and to know what materials were being used.
Yes, I don't know if are we going to talk about inspections or...
We'll get on to site visits later.
Okay.
So moving on to the full plans application,
Yeah.
Do you agree that a BCB, so building control body, would not generally accept a full plans application as being valid without the fee and or information being attached?
The term you've used, in this case, it isn't a building control body, it's only local authority. It's only local authorities that full plan applications go to. It's not approved inspectors, but for a local authority, which obviously RBKC is, I would expect them. The question said, would you expect a validation an acknowledgement, did you, when the application comes in?
But would you expect it to be valid when it comes in paper if
What do
the
you mean by-
drawings are not attached? So if it comes in paper with no drawings, would you validate that?
Well, you need to look at what the requirement is to put in there's guidance about full plans applications in the building regulations. And it's not like a planning application where all the information necessarily needs to be there right at the start. So predominantly you need an application. I think the only minimum legal requirement, and you'd need to check, is to have an application form, obviously the correct payment, and site plan. There's usually some information to start with. Often on design and build you may have structural calculations, for example.
So if there's just a form and no information at all, is that, in your view, a valid application?
If providing they had the correct fee, yes, because the environment is such that you want to receive the application. It may have been an application, particularly if it's a sizable project, that you've probably been speaking to them pre-application for a couple of years. So you may have that some pre-application information, which is, if we're going back to this one for Grenfell, there was some pre-application information in advance of that.
You say the environment is such that you would want to receive the application. Is that a reference to the competition between
Of course.
approved inspectors and
you may have been
authorities?
seeking, we're talking generally, you may have been seeking that application for a number of years. So getting the check in the application is the kind of, it means you've then won that project. And then obviously you can request the information through time as it becomes available.
So on the Grenfell project, if we go to RYD 301437.
Sorry, could you just help me, Mr. Allen? I was under the impression that a full plans application required, as the name suggests, full plans, and that the regulations had some reference to this. Am I wrong about that?
I'd need to see the regulation, but I believe that's not the case. There's a terminology, full plans. There's a different process to building notice or regularisation certificate. So it talks more about the different process. Full plans is more around, by the time it's approved, there's a full body of information, and then there's a requirement to check that within a statutory time period and issue a formal decision. That's not the case on the building notice. It's unlike planning. In planning, you need to have all the information. If it's not there, it's rejected. It doesn't go any further. That's not the case. We try and work with the applicants and to get the application in and then get the information all the way through to when it's finally built.
All right, thank you. Sorry, Ms. Grogan, to interrupt you.
If we go now to RYD 30143778. That's an email from Bruce Soanes to you. Dear John, further to your email last Tuesday, please see attached the completed full plans application for Grenfell, hard copy and drawings to follow. Was that receipt of the form sufficient to start the statutory time limit, so the statutory time period running?
You need the fee, you need the application fee as well.
So once the fee is paid, that's what starts the clock ticking?
Well, fee and the application form, yeah.
If we can now go to paragraph 14 of your statement, it's RBK 3033930. And paragraph 14, which I think would be on page 3. And zoom in there. And you say, starting with the second sentence, in recent years, with design and build, project information often arrived in stages throughout the build. Statutory time limits regarding approval or conditional approval or rejection were not usually adhered to in practice. In theory, if no decision was made, the application would be deemed approved, but in reality, no applicant ever took this point. Were you aware that on Grenfell, the drawings accompanying the full plans application were not sent to building control at all during the 5-week period?
I wasn't aware that it was in the 5-week period, but I do believe drawings were sent at some point.
Was it common on projects at this time that you would receive the application form, the fee, and then drawings would be delayed by weeks beyond the statutory time limit?
It could be.
Why not reject the full plans application at that stage?
You could have done. The process while I was building control manager and before my time as building control manager, there was a system in place for ensuring that applications received a decision within the statutory time period, which, as you know, is 5 weeks or 2 months if the applicant agrees. And this was before my time as well, but for larger projects, that time process just doesn't fit with the way that their information comes through. So there's no benefit in rejecting. I'll explain a little bit more about why there's no benefit in rejecting the application. But there's no benefit in sending a rejection because it doesn't really achieve too much. And the reason why there's not too much benefit in doing that is because, unlike planning, you're probably aware that you can build on a rejected plan. So the upshot of saying you're going to reject it is that they can still build on a rejected plan, and you can still issue a completion certificate on a rejected plan, whereas, you know, in the planning process, as far as I'm aware, because I'm not a planner, you can't start work until you have a planning permission.
Is the need to secure work in competition with approved inspectors related to this practice of not rejecting?
No, not
within
at all.
5
It's
weeks?
more about just trying to work with people and get to the best solution as quickly as you can and try and help people through the process.
Or throwing the book at them?
Sorry, would it be uncharitable then to conclude that no one's really following the regulations as far as the administration's concerned?
Not for larger projects, the time just doesn't fit. The information just isn't available. So, for example, on other projects, you may just have, for example, pilot. If it's a new build, you may just have the piling calculations, say, first up. There's it's not a process of, and they don't need to. People generally don't wait to have all the information. Some years ago, it may have been like that. They don't wait to have all the information absolutely nailed down before they then make the decision. Clearly, if I was building in my own house, I'd want the thing approved and done before I started, but they take a view on risk and just get on with it.
So I think what you're telling us is that the regulations haven't kept up with building practice, and so they are not complied with.
Well, there isn't a benefit. We could reject, and some building controls do reject. And what I would say, many years ago, there was the process when I first started, I wasn't the head, where they were rejected. So with the process you had, plan would come in, it'd be rejected. They'd send some more information, and it'd be rejected. Or you end up doing a part application. So, okay, we're just going to change the description. We're just going to put the application in just for the piling. Sometimes you had a situation where the client wanted to withdraw the application before the rejection because they didn't want the rejection. So you had this resubmission of full plans applications, resubmission, and the process just becomes all around for everybody laborious. So it's just a practical way.
That's helpful. I just wanted to understand, though, what the position is, and I think you've made that clear.
Okay,
Good,
thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you. You've referred to the application being deemed approved if there's no response within 5 weeks. What do you mean by deemed approved?
These first 2 pages, as you know, for the inquiry, there was a number of questions that were asked, and this 2 pages was just a kind of supplement, just to kind of try and explain it and help you. That was the purpose of it. The deemed approved is why it's in speech marks. Is first of all, it's under Section 36 of the Building Act. If you either have approved, if building control have either approved an application or failed to give a decision in time, the applicant is allowed to build in accordance with those plans. And if you then decide, you can't take action under 36, although you could take an injunction against them. Now, on all those counts, if anyone, in my experience, has ever, if the period's gone over 5 weeks or 2 months, no one's ever actually claimed that. But you could still take an injunction. But with the injunction, if it was found that the work was then okay, it's the local authority then would have to pay the costs of doing that, as far as I understand it. So the deemed approved was just a term, which I'd heard in the past as well when I was training, I was just trying to explain it to you and help.
If we could go to RBK 3048693, and I'm just looking at the dates here of these documents. So if you zoom in on the email at the top, it's an email from Mr. Hoban to Mr. Hanson dated 29th of September 2014, and he's asking there, in the context of the full plans application, for Mr. Hanson's observations under Part B. We can then see Paul Hanson's reply at RBK 3033895. We try 33894. Sorry, back to the date is there. I missed that. 33895. The date is on the front. 10th of November 2014. Can you explain why it took Paul Hanson over a month to respond to John Hoban? So that's his response.
Well, allied to what you're asking me, and I'd give the example with Grenfell and the time limits. Building Control have got an excellent relationship with the fire authority and the fire service, and we hold them in high regard. There are statutory time limits for the fire authority to deal with building control applications, which from memory it's either 2 weeks or 3 weeks. For most large projects, it is several months, 3 months, 6 months, that kind of time. So it's just not possible to do a satisfactory consultation and get it back within 5 weeks and 2 months. It's not possible. Ideally, if all the information was in, you sent it off to the brigade, they got back in 2 weeks. There is a lead possible, but their lead times are something like, well, they were when I was involved on larger projects, of that order, 3 to 6 months, which is why on Grenfell, there was I think I've seen it either in the evidence or we arranged to do a consultation on the smoke vent, but that was all kind of to try and help them. That was all pre-application. Technically, you shouldn't do it pre-application, but that was just trying to move something forward to help everybody,
That doesn't quite answer my question, which is, can you explain why Paul Hanson took over a month to reply? Do you know or do you not know?
Well, it would be in his workflow as far as the complexity of the information he had and the projects he had at the time. But that wouldn't seem like an unreasonable length of time for the complexity of the response that he's given. I'm sure you've seen the level of response that he gives.
Moving on now to your involvement with Grenfell Tower.
Yeah.
You said in your statement that you had some very limited involvement in a pre-application inquiry concerning the smoke control system, and for the transcript, that's paragraph 20 of your statement, and that you think John Jackson asked you to contact Terry Ashton from Exova Warrington. Did you contact Terry Ashton at that stage?
I think that was my recollection. I believe that Terry Ashton may have worked in a district surveyor's office that John was working in, so may have known him, and he may have made contact, but that could be totally wrong as well. But I think that was the starting point. Somebody contacted me or I contacted them because they wanted some pre-application advice.
Can you recall what you discussed with Terry Ashton?
I'd have put him in contact with my colleagues, which was either Dave Gammon or Paul Hanson. There was a question, I believe, about the smoke ventilation system.
At that time, so this is 2012, were you aware that the Grenfell project was going to involve recladding?
No.
When did you become aware?
I believe when the full plan application came in.
So up to that point, you didn't know
I don't believe so.
that cladding was involved?
So I think you may have... There's some... when I said pre-application, there was a number of pre-application meetings. I think there might have been a demolition, and all of that was recorded in Accolade. We wanted a hard record of all this stuff. So would be a description on the Accolade database of whatever the project was, and I don't believe that cladding was mentioned on the application form, or we mentioned it anyhow, until we repeated it for the full plan application.
Now, we know there was a meeting between you and Studio E and Exova on the 7th of November 2012. We do have minutes of that meeting, but we don't need to pull them up. I'm just interested in your recollection. At that meeting, when you were meeting to discuss the project, was cladding ever referred to?
I don't believe so. There are minutes of the meeting. I can't actually recall the meeting at all.
You then received 2 versions of the Exova outline fire safety strategy. I'm only going to ask you about version 2, but for the transcript, you received the first version on the 31st of October 2012, and the reference for that is EXO 401368. In 2013, so we've moved forward in time, you received version 2, and that's SEA 409805. And if we go to page 2 of that document, SEA 409805, page 2. And this is, Dear John and Paul, further to our meeting at RBKC on the 17th of August, we're now in position to forward you our proposed fire strategy.
Thank you.
For Grenfell Tower for comment. Please see attached the fire
Sorry,
strategy.
can I just start again? It wasn't large. It's fine
Sorry,
now, but it wasn't.
it's
Yeah.
the first paragraph there. Just saying that they've attached the fire strategy for comment, and you'll see the attachments there include the Grenfell Tower OFSS.
Yeah.
If we now go to the OFSS, which is EXO 50430, do you recall reading this document at the time?
I can't recall at all.
If we look at page 4 of that document, now in fairness to you, cladding proposals are not mentioned there in the list of what the refurbishment comprises. And at this point in time, can you help us on whether you knew, even in broad terms, whether cladding was involved?
I don't believe I did.
And if we could go on to page 8. Under 3.1.4, compliance with B4. It says it is considered that the proposed changes will have no adverse effect on the building in relation to external fire spread, but this will be confirmed by an analysis in a future issue of this report. Did you read that at the time?
I may have done. I can't recall.
Did you note that a future analysis was to be forthcoming?
I can't say I did. I just can't recall, I'm afraid.
Looking at that document now, assuming that you read this passage at the time, would you have noted to check with Ixova at a later date that they had provided this updated analysis?
Of course, but not necessarily on this vehicle. You'll be doing a check of the building regulation application, and having a schedule and an amendment letter, and then working through that. So if then cladding was added to the application, then clearly that would be an item. If you didn't have the information for it that complied in all the ways that we've spoken about earlier, then you'd obviously ask them for the information. It's not necessarily the fire engineer, it'd be whoever the applicant is you'll be writing to, because it's their application, that's one of their consultants, and maybe the information will come from somebody else.
Now, moving forward in time again, we've heard that John Hoban took over from you in December 2013. He said to the inquiry in his oral evidence that you sent him some emails, but there was no handover meeting. Do you have a specific recollection of a handover meeting taking place?
I can't. It was pre-application at this stage. The building regulation application hadn't been deposited. So if I would have forwarded him emails, they would be the correspondence that chiefly was from the Means of Escape group and the correspondence such as this.
Do you think it's right then that there was no handover meeting?
There's probably nothing to hand over because it wasn't an application to hand over.
Once John Hoban took over and before the site visit that you carried out on the 24th of March, what involvement did you have with Grenfell Tower?
I can't recall any. Sorry, saying that. There was some email exchanges with Janice Ray, I think, but I can't recall at the time of that to do with some gas risers or something.
That was after...
Was it after? I can't recall the time.
Check my notes.
And there could be people ask me things, but I haven't got any recollection of it.
Did John Hoban ever discuss the specifics of Grenfell Tower with you?
No. In our meetings, we spoke about just progress. So there is an odd note saying, how's Grenfell or something, in my planner, in relation to checking it and those kind of things.
Were you aware of how often he was visiting site?
No.
Did he ever tell you that he'd been informed that the cladding had been used on other buildings of a similar construction? No. As a building control surveyor yourself, would you have taken comfort if someone had told you that?
No, it does mention in Regulation 7 you can use past experience if that's the case, but generally speaking, you wouldn't trust what anybody's saying to you, even if they've said they've used it, and I could give it other examples if you wish, but you would pursue those other examples. And often people actually lie, and that's not the case. You know, it's normally a different scenario, and so I can think of at least 2 examples where things I've asked for, someone said, oh, that's unfair, we've done it somewhere else, and you look at that case and it's just a different case, or they've lied about it.
You went to site then on the 24th of March 2016.
Yeah.
What steps did you take to refamiliarise yourself with the project before this site visit?
I can't say, I can barely remember the inspection, and I can't recall the context of why I was going there. It come out in some evidence in the last couple of days or sometime that I was requested to look at the nursery. I think there was some evidence saying they wanted me to, so it was a request from the builder to look at the nursery, but I can't recall the time frame or how long I had and why I went there, and John Hoban hadn't gone there. I presume he was on leave or in a meeting or on a course or something.
We'll go to your notes of the site visit in a moment.
Yeah, but just to say about the time frame then, it depends. So if somebody, and it does happen, there may be a book of calls that somebody's got and they phone in the morning and say, I'm sick. So it's 9:30 and the first visit's 10, so you just go out and look at it as you do. So I don't know in this particular situation whether I had time to look at any of the information, but generally speaking, if I did, I probably would have looked at the site inspections, I would say, in advance, if I could.
By this stage, this is well after the full plans application, you knew that the project involved cladding?
Well, I would have done it. It was on the application form, and if I checked it, it would have been booked in, you know, so it would have said cladding, yeah.
But you didn't, at that stage, ask Mr. Hoban or look for any records to see what the cladding actually comprised of?
No.
When you went on site, how long did you spend there?
I don't know. Most sites you have to sign in and out. I don't know if you've been able to get a record of how long I was there.
I'm interested in your recollection. Can you recall how long you spent there?
I would recollect probably a couple of hours, certainly between 1 and 2 hours, I would say.
Do you think you looked at the hard copy file back at RBKC before you went?
Well, we know now there wasn't too much of a hard copy file, and you wouldn't necessarily take the drawings on site. We wouldn't want people to do so because the files are too large and moving around London, apart from things like climbing ladders, it's just not practical to walk around with drawings.
Mr. Allen, we don't know what state the hard copy file was in because it's gone.
Sorry. That's what I'm saying, yeah. Yeah.
But what's your recollection? Did you look?
I may have looked at Paul Hanson's means of escape file. I can't recall looking at, if you ask me, I can't recall looking at a hard copy file.
Did you speak with anyone on site when you went?
I can't recall. I would have done. You can't make visits on your own on building sites because of the safety restrictions. You're always accompanied, by and large.
Can we look at your notes then? It's RBK 30s52478. And it's page 3. So this is a printout or summary of what the notes on Accolade are all in one place. And you'll see that's your visit there in the second box. And it says, notes, cladding nearly complete. Did you go up Mass Climbers to look at the cladding?
I don't believe so. This is March 2016. I'm looking at the other correspondence. I think it was finished, was it in June or July? Sometime, if we went up, it's probably June or July. Presumably as people have got photographs to show whether there was mast climbers in position at this point. I wouldn't have gone up the mast climb. I can't recall doing it. I don't know if the mast climbers were in position or not. But you could probably look at some photographic evidence and do a timeline.
When you observed the cladding, which you obviously did because you've noted it's nearly complete, did you say to yourself, that looks like ACM?
I wouldn't be aware how to externally differentiate the difference. I'm not sure many people could. So,
did you ask anyone on site what the cladding was made up of?
I did, and it may be that this is an area where maybe the mast climbers have been taken down, and there was just some isolated, gaps that just clearly need to be filled.
You say you did ask.
No.
in the transcript, or did you mean to say you didn't?
No. Well, I've asked here by saying that ensure thermal insulation completely fills voids.
Well, that's not an answer to my question, which was,
Sorry.
did you ask what the cladding was made of?
No, I didn't.
Did you ask what the insulation was made of?
No.
You observed the insulation. Did you form any view about what it might be made of?
I can't recall what it was at all.
When you say there, ensure thermal insulation completely fills voids, what was that in reference to?
It was from the ground. I could see there was some gaps in the cladding or the insulation, and I was making sure that the thermal envelope is complete.
So you yourself weren't interested at all in whether the facade itself was compliant with the building regulations?
I didn't say that.
Well, you didn't ask what it was, so you weren't going to be able to form a view, were you?
No, but that's not the question you asked. Was I interested in whether the facade is? Could you repeat the question you said? Sorry.
Well, I asked you yourself weren't interested at all in whether the facade itself was compliant with the building regulations.
Well, as a whole, of course you're interested. In relation to that particular visit, I was asked to come and look, because it turns out the nursery, and as I was passing, it was obvious that the cladding, because there were some gaps in it from the ground level looking up, there were some gaps which clearly need to be filled. Then you're asking me whether I was interested. Well, of course you're interested, because the building's there. It doesn't mean then you go and check every single element on each inspection you do. For example, structure, the floors, new floors that were put in. I wouldn't suddenly start unearthing those. Or
did you take any steps at all to satisfy yourself in any way whether the facade was compliant?
Well, that wasn't, I don't believe, the purpose of that inspection. And as I was trying to say, there's other elements that are life safety in relation to the building, such as the concrete floors, fire, dry risers, fire alarms, smoke ventilation, emergency lighting, all of these things. And it doesn't mean each time you do a visit, you go over and check all those elements again.
Why didn't you check the compliance of the insulation for yourself?
Well, it's not the time to do it there. As I said, as I just said, you wouldn't go and each time a visit is requested that you do a audit of each element that's been looked at previously.
You don't think you checked the file? You don't think you had a conversation with Mr. Hoban about what was being installed on the tower? And so you come to site and you don't ask anyone or ask yourself whether or not the facade complies with Part B4 of the regulations. Why is that?
Each time you do an inspection, it is an audit to the whole building. And just to repeat what I said, for example, there was new concrete floors put in, so obviously the structure would be important as well. It doesn't mean then you unearth the reinforcements and start going through the structure. And there wasn't too many notes about the structural floors in the notes or any other element. You see, as it is at the time.
Yeah, Mr. Allen, I was going to ask you this. You obviously noted that the cladding was nearly complete because you included that in your note. So something struck you worth noting.
Well, there'll be a hole,
Well, that's my question. Can you remember what you did notice about the cladding?
Not at all.
I mean, were there panels missing? Was there insulation exposed? Do you recall?
This is looking from the ground. I can't even recall. I haven't got a picture in my head now of where I was. I can't even picture how I got into the building. I just can't. I've got no recollection. Yeah. So I'd be guessing to fill in the gaps as far as what those notes say.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, this was great.
Thank you. Go to RBK 3018811, please. That's a copy of the completion certificate with your signature on it. Mm-hmm. Were you involved at all in the decision to issue a completion certificate?
No, the process is laid out and in the full plan procedure that I think you've now referred to previously.
Were you involved in the issue of the certificate?
No, because I was saying it wasn't in our full plan procedure. There wasn't a process for me to be involved in the signing off of the completion certificate. So as in all cases, and this case, that's an electronic signature that's generated once the surveyor is happy that the works comply with the building regulations.
So it's in your name, but you didn't have anything to do with it?
That's correct.
Mr. Hoban described a process whereby a surveyor would check with those on site whether Regulation 38 of the building regulations had been complied with. And he described a practice in your department whereby surveyors would seek an oral assurance from the contractor that Regulation 38 had been complied with, but they didn't check independently. Is that an accurate description of the practice within RBKC?
Yeah, you'll be aware that Regulation 38 to do with fire safety information, it was Regulation 16B prior to that, which is referred to in the approved document that was valid at the time, 16B. And there is an appendix at the back of the approved document. I don't know if we've got time to go to it, but Appendix G, I think it is, and it outlines the fire safety information. But Regulation 38, as you know, it's quite a short regulation, but and I haven't got the words here. Have you got Regulation 38 on screen? I could summarise any.
It's a short question, Mr.
Yeah.
Allen.
No,
was there a practice within your department?
No,
I was just asking.
It's important I explain the context. The Regulation 38 is about the person has carried out the work has got to hand fire safety information to the kind of owner or occupier. That's what it basically says. It doesn't say building control are kind of in the loop on that. What would typically happen, and I do agree with John Hoban, typically on site, you would make sure there's usually, I think they call them O&M manuals, with all the operational and maintenance manuals. You'd normally make sure, particularly if the client was there, bear in mind this was the TMO, you would usually have some conversation in the site office, have you had the information? It wouldn't be a forensic examination to make sure, for example, as you know, building control don't get as-built drawings at the end of a job, but as-built drawings are one of the things in the fire safety information, so you wouldn't kind of have the drawings and forensically look at it to make sure it's exactly as was built necessarily. That's, but it's making sure that one has passed into the other, and if he's done that, I'd say that was adequate.
Compliance with Regulation 38 is a prerequisite for a completion certificate pursuant to Regulation 17 being issued.
Yes.
Why not ask for a statement in writing from the contractor that they've done it?
You could. There isn't a requirement to do that, but asking for a statement, as we know, of what information you're provided, it doesn't mean that's been done. I would say, and I don't know the context, I always usually check with the clients, if they was on site, which they often are towards the end of a job, have you received the information? And clearly, did they on this particular project? If the TMO did receive the fire safety information, is it theoretical? Did it happen is the question. Did the TMO get the fire safety information, or is it a theoretical question?
Following the Grenfell Tower fire, was any internal investigation ever carried out by the Building Control Department into how and why building control approval had been granted for the refurbishment works?
I don't believe so. There would be a legal review by the legal team, but you'd have to speak to RBKC's legal team about that.
Can you account for how a completion certificate was issued in circumstances where it is now accepted that the cladding did not comply with B4 of the building regulations?
Well, because the building control officer at the time believed the work, as far as he could ascertain, complied with the building regulations, and as I mentioned previously, the responsibility for compliance with the building regulations remains with the people carrying out the work, which is usually the builder, the architect, in some cases can be the owner.
Can you account for how Mr. Hoban made some fundamental errors whilst on your watch?
I saw Mr. Hoban's evidence yesterday. He carried out his work to the best of his ability, and he believed the work complied with the building regulations.
Just have one final topic to cover with you, Mr. Allen, and then we'll take a pause to see if there are any further questions that need to be asked. We talked before about the culture within RBKC, Building Control Department. Are you aware of any occasion when a building surveyor raised issues with an unmanageable workload in the department prior to the Grenfell fire?
Back before my time as building control manager, it was often a thing between surveyors around, as you mentioned before, about job numbers or he's got these projects and he's got those, and he completes his records, he doesn't, and that was well before my time as the manager. It wasn't even in the section I was in, so it's something that's happened, now and again over the years. But the main point would be that the workload was manageable, definitely. As an example, which I was thinking about during the break, there was times where I had to establish a late cover because people used to go home so early. So it's more about trying, to have at least somebody there to answer the phones and things. That was more the issue. People didn't do more hours than they was needed to.
What about safety concerns? Are you aware of anyone having raised safety concerns?
No, I was, at various times, I was the health and safety manager for the whole of planning and borough development. It's something I was very, very keen on. So we had health and safety briefings, toolbox talks. I made sure all the PPE was up to date. I've mentioned some health and safety things today, I think, in the giving of the evidence.
Were you aware that it had been said that there was a culture of bullying and surveyors' concerns were not taken seriously when raised?
No.
And I'm going to show you a document. It's RBK 14152. And if we zoom in on the top half, please. This is an email from Robert Albro, dated 16th of June 2017.
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting that you saw this particular email at the time. It's to Graham Stallwood. And he says, "Dear Graham, private and confidential, following the tragic events at Grenfell Tower, I wish to offer my unconditional support to the building control officer concerned. I worked for RBKC as a senior building control surveyor for many years and mostly had a positive time. It is, however, with regret that I feel the need to repeat the concerns I had with management team at the time, all of which are well documented." And he goes on, "I sincerely believe surveyors' concerns were never taken seriously. On one occasion, I utilised the council's whistleblowing policy. Even then, the management team failed to follow the panel's recommendations and acted contrary to the published guidance. I even recall being told if a corporate manslaughter charge was to be brought, it would be the head of building control who would be liable, not myself." And then we move on to the next paragraph, which is now at the top. "I am also in possession of documentation whereby I specifically asked a builder to open up an element of work, to later find John Allen undermined my decision and approved the work without speaking to me about this issue. At the time, I asked John to make a site note to this effect, which he failed to do. To cover my back, I sent an email. The response I got was that it was inappropriate to enter an email dialogue when he sat in the next room. I read this to mean no paper trail. Needless to say, the note never got recorded." And then you will also observe I question workloads across the department. And a little further down, at the bottom of the page, at the last paragraph that we can see on screen, it says, "Be under no illusions. I believe the department is afflicted by a culture of bullying and surveyors' concerns are not taken seriously when raised." Were you aware of those issues being raised at the time?
I disagree with the whole essence of it. I was aware of this correspondence or something like it. I could talk personally about Rob Albrow if you wish me to, and quite a long, there were various disciplinaries and grievances and things went over with personnel, went for quite a long time. I could give you some background. I did employ him to start with as part of the management team, and I was helping him at one stage when he'd come from another team into the team that I managed. So I could talk at length about that if you wish, but it's safe to say that the context I refute, absolutely.
I would just like you to answer my questions. Were you aware prior to the restructuring of concerns about safety not being taken seriously?
Absolutely not.
Were you aware of concerns with workload before the restructuring?
Other than what I've said, it's an office and there are swings, there's times, work ebbs and flows, the patch systems that have got the nature of that. The reason we worked the patch system is because clients wanted the one point of contact all the time, but then there's pros and cons about that. But we tried to manage the work when it did ebb and flow.
Prior to your appointment as manager of building control, was there a culture of bullying in the department?
I don't believe so.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. Those are all the questions I have for you, but we have to take a pause now as there may be some more from others.
Right, Mr. Allen. Well, as you've heard, Councillor treats the end of the questions that she had for you, but we need to take a break now to just make sure nothing's been overlooked and to consider any questions that may have come in from other sources. So we're going to stop now until 25 to 4.
Okay.
And then if you come back, then we'll see whether there are any more questions or not.
Understood.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks so much. We'd like to go to the usher, please.
Okay.
Thank you. 25 to 4, please. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Mr. Allen to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Allen.
Thank you.
Ms. Gregan, did you find some questions?
I did, Mr. Chairman, just a few.
Yes.
So starting first, we've heard some evidence that Mr. Hoban was not provided with a copy of the NBS specification for the project. And I think you referred to that earlier in your evidence as well, that you'd never seen the NBS specification. Is it standard practice for building control not to have the NBS specification on a project?
I don't know what the NBS specification is. Does it stand for, is it National Building Standard Specification or something? What does it stand for?
Yes, so that's
It is.
the specification that lists out what products
Yeah.
are being installed.
So the short answer is probably no. What often people do on projects, because you don't need often to know incredible detail and phone numbers of manufacturers and things like that, you may be given the plans, and then often architects will do a kind of supplementary statement explaining how they've kind of complied with regulations. That would often be the case, and then go into detail as needed. But going through a very detailed, the submission can be plans or specification drawings, it can be anything. So we'll take whatever people are going to offer to us and ascertain whether it complies with the building regulations or not. And if it doesn't, ideally write a schedule.
In the absence of a complete list of the materials that are being used, for example, on a facade,
Yes.
how is the building control surveyor supposed to assess a full plans application?
Well, it would be difficult to, but you would ask for it. That's the thing. So in your schedules, you'd ask for the information if it wasn't there.
Going back, we just before the break, we were discussing the email from Mr. Albro. If we could go to another email, which is RBK 3032518. So this is another email, which if you go on to page 2, you'll see there another email from him dated the 7th of July 2017, and you are copied in. If we zoom in so that you can see it. Do you recall receiving that email at the time?
I can't. I know there were, and I said I'm happy to go into some detail if you wish, over many years with various involvement I had. But do you want me? Shall I just read it?
I just have one question for you. So he says, if I just find the right part of the email, if we could go down to the next paragraph, please.
So what date's this one? Sorry.
7th of July.
Okay.
And it's the third paragraph down, and a few lines down. It says, I have asked that my statement be accepted, that many related to a previous grievance which had not been actioned, safety concerns raised under the whistleblowing policy, and the department's view to take a direction contrary to published guidance, and finally your role, and he's referring to you there, to undermine my decision when I gave an instruction for defective work to be opened up. This includes correspondence between us in which you failed to enter a site note to that effect. Indeed, you said if I wanted to talk to you, to go to your office rather than send an email. I maintain the view this was to avoid accountability. Is it correct that you instructed Mr. Albro to raise matters orally with you rather than in writing?
In part, but I can explain the context. He was in another team, and there was a disciplinary being taken against him by management, which they asked me to lead. So I was doing that, then it was kind of dropped at one point. But I welcomed him into one of the teams that I managed at the time. This was before I was building control manager. I was an assistant district surveyor then. He was still pursuing some grievances he had with the previous manager. And in the end, I said, OK, we will give you 1 day a week to deal with the grievance. But you can't be dealing with it all the time in the office. And often, at that time, I did have my own separate office, and I found it just uncomfortable where you're sitting there and someone's sending you an email and they're only the other side of the office. And I just said to him, if you've got an issue, please come and talk to me about it. But it was just mainly to help him. What I would say is, about the decisions, some people in building control sometimes find it difficult to make decisions, and Robert was one of those. So on certain jobs, it's not about overruling him. I'm a senior manager, and sometimes if I just feel that the element complies, then obviously I can just pass it. Even though it may be against what he's advised, which in my opinion was incorrect and not in accordance with knowledge I had at the time. So Rob had his issues. I tried to help him as much as I possibly could. He did leave the council in the end. I can explain the circumstances of that, but I don't actually know all of that. But it was a lot above my level.
In the context of record keeping on a job, which is what he's referring to here, did you say to him that he should just talk to you about this site note issue rather than email?
No, not about site notes. I was talking to him about if he's got an issue with me or a problem, don't email me, come and talk to me about it, because he'd be sitting there all day long doing it. As I said, we tried to say, okay, can you just have a day a week dealing with your grievances, which seemed a reasonable amount of time, you know.
Going back to some evidence we heard from you this morning, I asked you whether the core of an ACM panel would be thought of as filler under 12.7 of ADB.
Yeah.
And you replied with reference to the insulation that be installed behind the panels. Could you just tell us, what did you understand at the time the word filler to mean in 12.7 of ADB? Well,
as I mentioned, my understanding was the filler is anything then that's going to be in the line of the insulation, anything that's going to fill it. It could be, there are various intumescent mastics, foam, those kind of things, that maybe there's small gaps on the line of the insulation. And as I mentioned, that it's been qualified both by the extra, in the latest approved document B volume 1, there's a note been added that now says, in the opinion of the government, that they did mean filler to include the the material between the ACM. So that's cleared it up now, but that wasn't my understanding at the time.
We also discussed your knowledge of the proposals in that pre-application stage for Grenfell Tower. If you could go to SEA 404471. And you'll see at the bottom of the page, there's an email from Bruce Soanes to you dated 6th of June 2012. And it says, John, further to our conversation, please see attached an initial estimate of the work. You'll see it exceeds the budget, but it does give you an idea of the scope of the work. So that's Mr. Soanes sending you an email with some details so that you could come up with a fee. Do you recall that?
I don't, but the fees would have been tied in with a project quote. So if you look at the pre-application on Accolade was PA, it kind of makes sense, and project quote was PQ. So I would have recorded the project quote in Accolade.
If you go up to the top of the page, we can see your response. And there you advise on the fee, and you say you've excluded items such as demolition that are not controlled under the building regulations.
Yeah.
So can we take it that you went through the budget cost estimate to work out what the building control fee would be?
Yes, I'm not sure what he sent through. You wouldn't want a bill of quantities or full specification, but if someone gave you outline budgets, you would just say like landscaping out, anything to do with the building in, that kind of level. I'm not sure what was included.
So if we go to ART 6053, this is what he sent you. And we go to page 4, please. Under item R. Which we see there says option 1, new cladding including insulation allows, say, VM zinc rain screen, or option 2, new render. So having looked at this for the purposes of preparing the building control fee, you were told at the time that cladding was going to be involved as part of the refurbishment project.
Yeah, I can't recall. I can't recall the document. If it was sent, and I've read all of it, then I would have known, but I didn't know at the time.
So that didn't jump out at you at the time? And would cladding works have featured in the calculation of a building control fee?
It would be included. That 1.124 million would have been included in the whatever the figure was. Was it 4 million? Was it? I'd have,
So you likely would have read it, noted the cost, and that would have featured in your assessment.
I believe so. Yeah.
So at the time, you did know that cladding
Well,
was involved.
from what you've shown me now, I can't recall the document, but
Final set of questions. This is relating back to your site visit. Now, we know that you did see some of the insulation in the cladding on site. That was your evidence before the break. Now, you're an experienced building control officer. You've gone on site and you see being installed hardboard insulation, not mineral wool.
I couldn't recall at all what the insulation was. I just couldn't. I haven't got any recollection of it now.
But you noted it in your site reports that you saw it. So we know you saw it at the time, the insulation in the cladding.
Yeah.
What you would have seen is insulation board rather than mineral wool. Would that not have piqued your interest at the time to ask, well, what is this?
I can't recall. Honestly, can't. I've got no recollection of what I saw. If I say something now, I can't. It would be guessing. I can't say. I don't have a recollection at this time.
That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Right, thank you very much. Well, Mr. Allen, that is the end of the questions. Nothing else to ask you. Thank you very much. Just remains for me to thank you very much for coming to give your evidence. It's been very helpful and useful to hear what you have to tell us.
Thank you.
And now you're free to go.
Thank you very much.
Right. I'm sorry we've taken longer, by the way, over your evidence than we'd first hoped, but I'm afraid that's how things sometimes go.
Not at all. I was glad to help.
Right.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, now we have another witness waiting, but we need to rise for a moment, I think, for a bit of housekeeping, isn't that right?
We do, that's right. And then Mr.
Yes.
Millett will be taking
Well,
over for the
perhaps
last.
someone could come and find us as soon as it's all been done.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett. Now,
Yes.
who's your next witness?
Mr. Chairman, we now have the first of the Artelia witnesses, Mr. Simon Cash. Can I please call Mr. Cash?
Please read out the witness affirmation text.
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Good. Thank you very much, Mr. Cash. Sit down, make yourself comfortable.
Thank you.
I think you've probably been here quite a long time waiting to give evidence, and
I have.
I'm sorry that we've kept you waiting so long, but I'm afraid these things sometimes happen, but at least we're able to start this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Cash, good afternoon. Can I start by thanking you very much for coming to the inquiry and helping us with our investigations? We are very grateful to you. My questions are intended to be short and simple. They don't always turn out that way. So if you want me to repeat a question or put the question in a different way, I'm very happy to do so. Also, if you could please keep your voice up so that the person who is sitting to your immediate right, the transcriber, can get your evidence down on the transcript, we'd be very grateful. And
Yes.
by way of a tip, it also helps to say yes or no rather than nod or shake your head as appropriate, because
Yes.
that doesn't go down onto the transcript.
Okay.
Today we will finish, I think, at 4:30, subject to the chairman, but normally we will take a break in the morning and in the afternoon. But if you need a further break, just let us know and we can take a short break.
Thank you.
Now, you've made three witness statements for the inquiry, I think, and your first one is ART 406544.
Yes.
And that one is dated the 11th of October 2018. Could you go to page 74, please? There's a signature there. Is that yours?
Yes, it is.
I'm going to
Yes.
call that your first statement, or first witness statement. You have a second witness statement. That's ART 407399. There's a signature on page 25. Is that your signature?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. That's dated the 13th of September 2019. And I'll call that your second witness statement. You also made a third statement, ART 409416. And if we can go to page 20 of that, there's a signature. Is that your signature?
Yes, it is.
That's above the date of the 10th of March. I'll call that your third witness statement. Have you read each of these witness statements recently?
Yes, I have.
And can you confirm that their contents are true?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. And have you discussed your statements or the evidence that you're going to give today and tomorrow with anybody before coming here to give evidence?
No, I haven't.
Now, I'm going to begin with your background and work history. You're a quantity surveyor by training, I believe.
That's correct, yes.
And I think you have more than 40 years' experience in project and cost management.
Correct.
And is it right that you are a fellow of the RICS
Correct.
and I think past chair of its construction faculty?
Correct.
And I think you're also a past member of its Building Engineering Services Business Group. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, before the Grenfell Tower project, had you ever before been involved in projects involving a refurbishment of a high-rise residential building?
I cannot specifically remember, although in my career I've worked on many, many projects, some of which I can recollect easily and others not quite so easily.
And can you recollect any of them which involve refurbishment of a high-rise residential building, do you
Not
think?
particularly, no.
Right. Now, in very general terms, I think your role at Artelia during the Grenfell Tower refurbishment was as project director.
For that project, yes.
Yeah, for that project. Yes.
Correct.
What was your role in general at Artelia outside the Grenfell Tower project?
I was a director of cost management.
I see. And Artelia's involvement spanned the years really from March 2012 through to the end of the project.
Correct.
From 2012, was your involvement throughout that entire period, or were you involved for a shorter period?
I was involved throughout that period, with the exception of a small portion of time when I was absent for an operation.
Yes. And in general, project director, is that the senior-most role within Artelia on a particular project?
Correct.
And in general, is it right that to be a project director on a particular project, you would have to occupy a pretty senior role within Artelia overall?
Generally, yes.
Yes. And can you just briefly explain to us what your role as project director on the Grenfell Tower project involved?
It was to be primarily responsible for the delivery of the service to the project that we had signed up to with the client.
And did you have anybody within Artelia that you would report to?
Yes, I had a co-director who was my senior co-director that I reported to, and I also reported to the main board.
Right. Who was that? Who was that senior co-director that you reported to?
Mr. Philip Bulcott.
Right. Could you repeat the name? I'm sorry.
Mr. Philip Bulcott, Boulcoutt.
Thank you. Now, is it right that as a project director, or as project director, you weren't necessarily involved in the detail of the refurbishment project?
Correct.
And if there is any detail, then just that you can remember in any of my questions, and please just say
Yes.
or add to them. Now, some of the documents that we will look at in the course of your evidence have the name Appleyards on them. And it's right, I think, that Appleyards was an entity which was acquired by Artelia, or the Artelia Group.
That's right.
And I believe that was in March 2012, was it?
Yes.
I see. Now, Appleyards was trading, I think, as Artelia UK for some time, wasn't it?
Correct.
And when I talk about Artelia or Appleyards, and I use the word Artelia, I'm going to include Appleyards in that, just so that we're clear.
Yeah.
Can I start then by looking at the role of Artelia, which would include Appleyards as a name, during the primary refurbishment works? And I want to look first, if we may, at Artelia's contracts, which were relevant to the Grenfell Tower project. In general, we can see from the documents that Artelia proposed a contract to the TMO on the RICS standard form. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And that was in May 2012, yes?
Yes.
Yes. And can we go to ART 406259, please? This is an email from Mark Anderson of the TMO of the 21st of August 2012 to Alan Dawson. And I think Alan Dawson was Artelia's employer's agent on this project until March 2013. Is that right?
Correct.
Yes. And Alan Dawson is an Artelia or Appleyards person at the time, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Yeah. Is this email, we'll look at the text of it. Good afternoon. I confirm that KCTMO wishes to appoint Appleyards Limited as outlined in the proposal dated 2nd of May 2012 under standard RICS terms of engagement. Was that the acceptance by the TMO of the May 2012 proposal?
Yes, it was.
Now, it looks from other documents that there were formalities of signing this contract which were overlooked at that time. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know why that is?
No, I don't.
But in any event, regardless of the formalities, is it your understanding that Artelia was contracted on the Grenfell Tower project from, at the latest, August 2012?
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
Yes.
In terms of the acceptance by the TMO, yes.
Yes. Now, do you remember that in July 2014, there was a formal contract that was signed?
Yes.
Yes. And if we can go to that, that's at ART 405742, please. Now, we'll look at the first page. This is a letter, a formal letter, which is sent by Lisa de Jesus on behalf of Jenny Jackson at Assets and Regenerations for Kensington and Chelsea TMO to you at Artelia UK on the 9th of July 2014. Dear Mr. Cash, Grenfell Tower Enhancements. Please find enclosed the contract as signed by Kensington and Chelsea TMO. Apologies for the delay. And we can see on page 2, if we can just go to that the contract is on the RICS standard form of consultant's appointment. Do you recognise this document as having received it as the 2014 contract?
Yes, I do.
It's right, isn't it, that in the RICS standard form, consultant, the word consultant, means Artelia and client means TMO?
Correct.
Yes. And just for clarity's sake, if you want to see that, that's page 6. If we can just flash that up so everyone can see it. There it is. Now, just for, again, a little bit more detail, is it right that Artelia for the Grenfell Tower project, had a number of subcontractors, including ADS Associates.
He was, I wouldn't say he was a subcontractor, he was a freelance quantity surveyor who worked for the business occasionally.
I see. And working on Grenfell to provide quantity surveying services for the M&E elements.
He had some input, but not specifically dealing with that solely.
I see. What other elements did ADS Associates?
Sorry, he didn't deal with any other elements. He was brought in only to deal with a couple of specific elements of the M&E, but otherwise it was all dealt with by in-house employees.
Right, and just for dates, can you remember the dates when ADS Associates were brought in?
Not specifically, no, but I remember they were both pre-contract, both pre-construction contract.
Right. We have him as October 2013. Would that be about right?
Sounds about right, yes.
Right. Then there's also RE Solutions. And is that right, that was Neil Reed, who left, I think, Artelia into July 2015, but came back into the project through his own service company?
Correct, yes.
And I think he continued to work on the Grenfell Tower project throughout, but in those latter months as RE Solutions.
Correct, yes.
I see. Can we next turn to the role of Artelia set out in the RICS form? If we can go, please, in this document to page 10, first of all, I want to show you the part dealing with lead consultant. And this is, as I say, page 10 of the RICS form sent to you on the 9th of July 2014. And here at clause 3, we can see consultants' obligations, and then under that, performance of the services. And then at 3.4, about a quarter of the way down the page, it says, if the consultant is designated as lead consultant in the appendix, the consultant coordinates the activities of the professional team and gives instructions to the professional team as necessary. As lead consultant, the consultant schedules the activities so as to comply with the programme and informs the client of any failure by any member of the professional team to comply with the programme. Now, I've read that out in full because I have some questions about it. Can we next go to page 34? Do you recognise this as the appendix to the contract?
Yes, I do.
And at the bottom half of the page, you can see there are clauses 3.4 and 3.5, and they refer back to the terms we've just been looking at under the heading lead consultant. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And it says the consultant is not the lead consultant. So that means, doesn't it, that Artelia was not the lead consultant?
Correct.
Right. Now, we can see the box has been ticked with it, well, or rather crossed. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
So that's an option to say that Artelia was not taking on the role of lead consultant. Am I right about that?
Correct.
Right. And then we go on, and I'm sorry to take this at piecemeal pace, but it's important. Below that, the lead consultant is Bruce Soanes of Studio E. The consultant is the lead consultant underneath that, and that box isn't ticked. So that tells us that Bruce Soanes of Studio E was the lead consultant. And in that role, was the lead consultant to undertake a scheduling or programme role?
I don't know what the Studio E's scope of service was, but other than they were identified within this particular appointment as lead consultant.
I see. Well, in general terms, what did you understand the role of lead consultant to involve or include?
Effectively leading the design team and making sure that they delivered what they were required to under their scopes of services in accordance with the programme that was developed by the team.
Right. Was it not your job as consultant, Artelia, to at least to understand what the scope of services to be provided by the lead consultant was to be?
No, we were not involved in the appointment of the consultants. That was something that was specifically not ticked within our scope of service.
Well, let's look on. If you go to page 9, I should just show you the definitions here because some of the questions I'm going to ask you may depend on them. So I'll just show you this first. At page 9, you can see that, in fact, I think it's page 8, actually. You can see the definition of professional team. And the professional team there, yes, thank you, means the consultant which is Artelia, the professionals listed in the appendix, and any other professionals engaged by the client in relation to the project and which the client notifies to the consultant. Now just have that definition in mind. At the time of signing this document, July 2014, what was your understanding of who it was who was to be in charge of the professional team as defined?
In charge, I'm not sure. In terms of lead consultant, Studio E were identified as lead consultant.
Yes. They were. All right, well, let me come back to that question, given that answer a little bit later. Now, we know that Artelia was contracted directly to the TMO, as we've seen. Did Artelia at any stage answer to Studio E or otherwise to anybody who was in charge of the professional team? Or was Artelia independent of the professional team and acted solely as TMO's consultant?
We acted independently, solely as TMO's consultant.
Right. I next want to turn, following this questioning line generally, through to the next point, which is design responsibility. Can we look at page 11 of this document? And on page 11, we can see at the bottom half of the page, clause 4.4, design responsibility. And this is under the bigger heading, just a little bit further up, health and safety, statutory requirements and prohibited materials. And if you look at clause 4.4, under the heading design responsibility, it says the consultant is only responsible for the design of the project or any part of it, and or for specifying and approving materials for the project or any part of it, if and to the extent that it is designated as having such responsibility in the appendix. So that's the starting point for 4.4, design responsibility. And if we can go next to page 35 of this document, we come into the appendix and we can see at the top of that page, under or by reference to 4.4, design responsibility, it says the consultant is not responsible for the design of the project. And that project is marked, crossed through. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
The contrary terms, you can see that below, the consultant is responsible for the design, etc., are crossed through. And you can see that that is so in relation to that part and also the part immediately below it about specifying and approving materials. Yes?
Correct.
So is it for that reason that you say that because of that, Artelia wasn't responsible for the design or the materials on this project?
Correct.
Right. Who did you understand to have responsibility for the design and for the selection of materials on the Grenfell Tower project?
Studio E, Max Fordham and Curtains.
And who do you recall, or did you think at the time, was responsible for coordinating the design team?
Studio E as lead consultant.
And what about coordinating M&E and structural design?
The Studio E as lead consultant would also be coordinating them as well in the overall aspect of the design.
And who did you understand had responsibility for design?
Studio E overall.
And same question in respect of specifying or approving materials. Was that Studio E?
Yes.
Right.
As well as Curtains and Max Fordham as well.
I see. Now let's look on to further services that Artelia did agree to provide. If we can go back, please, in the same document to page 23, we can see the middle of the page. This is under Schedule 1, services. The basic services to be performed by the consultant, and that's Artelia, are those indicated in the attached schedules as identified below. And there's a whole set of services which are deleted under RICS Building Surveyor Services. And then we have RICS CDM Coordinator Services. That's ticked.
Yes.
Or rather crossed. And then RICS Employers Agent Services, again, there's a cross in that box. RICS Project Manager Services are deleted. RICS Project Monitor Services are deleted. But RICS Quantity Surveyor Services are crossed.
Correct.
So we see that there are therefore three services that Artelia, as the consultant, were taking on CDM coordinator, employer's agent, and quantity surveyor, but 2 that they weren't taking on, project manager and project monitor. Have I got that right?
Correct.
Yeah. Now, let's talk first about the CDM coordinator role that we can see from that document Artelia assumed. Now, CDM, just to delve into that a little bit, that stands for Construction, Design and Management Regulations, doesn't it?
Correct.
And the applicable regulations for most of the Grenfell Tower project were those set out in the 2007 regulations, weren't they?
Yes.
And they then changed in 2015, and we'll come to that in detail later on in your evidence, but that's correct, isn't it?
Correct.
And is it right that the project was required under those regulations to have a CDM coordinator, or CDMC as we call it?
Yes.
Yes. And I want to look at the role of the CDM coordinator under those regulations. First question is, who was appointed initially to be CDM coordinator for the Grenfell Tower refurbishment?
Is an individual. It was Keith Bushell.
Yes. And then I think later, was this right? Colin James and Paul Barrows?
Paul Burrows.
Burrows, quite right,
Correct.
from March, April 2015 through to October of that year.
Yes.
And in general terms, what was your understanding at the time of what a CDM coordinator did?
But his role was to specifically look at the design with respect, or look at the design risks in terms of making sure that the work could be carried out safely on site, in terms of both those operatives on site and the public, and that the final works could be also maintained safely. In terms of carrying out any maintenance works or anything that might be of risk to the public, and identifying that with the design team in design risk assessments, health and safety design risk assessments.
Were you familiar with the approved code of practice, or ACOP, for the 2007 regulations?
I was aware of the ACOP, but I wasn't familiar with it, what they contained, no.
Right. Did you know that they were also known as L144?
No.
Right. Well, let's have a look at it. It's INQ 30133936, please. There it is. Just looking at it, you say you were aware of it but not familiar with it. Had you ever seen it before the Grenfell Tower project and your involvement in it?
I can't remember.
All right. Well, let's see how we go with it. Page 25, please, and I'd like to look with you at paragraph 90. Yes, under the top of the page, it's what CDM coordinators should do, and it says CDM coordinators must A, give suitable and sufficient advice and assistance to clients in order to help them to comply with their duties, in particular, 1, the duty to appoint competent designers and contractors, and 2, the duty to ensure that adequate arrangements are in place for managing the project. Were you aware at the time that those duties applied to Artelia?
I was aware of those duties. In terms of applying to Artelia, with respect to the designers were had already been brought on board prior to Artelia's involvement in the project. But it wouldn't necessarily have stopped Keith Bushell from making sure that the client, the TMO, were aware of their obligations under the CDM regulations.
I see. So you're saying that Studio E had already arrived onto the Grenfell Tower project before Artelia were involved in that project?
Correct.
But that nonetheless, that those obligations still maintained as applicable?
Yes.
Yes. Now, if we go to what the contract says about CDMC, at page 61 of the contract, that's ART 405742, please, at page 61. Back to that, into page 61. Here is a part of that which deals with the services relating to the CDM regulations 2007. And I just want to just pick up the part in bold italics at the top for context, really. The services which are summarised below are derived from the duties laid on the CDM coordinator by the regulations and other related requirements of the regulations. Those listed are mandatory for the CDM coordinator. Reference should be made to the regulations for the precise scope of each service, and this schedule must be read within the context of the regulations as a whole. And then we see under item 3, advise and assist the client in appointment of competent designers and contractors. Did you understand at the time that Artelia had that obligation to the TMO?
Yes, I did.
You did. Did Artelia provide advice on the appointment of competent designers on the project?
I'm not sure as to whether they did or not, but as I say, the designers were already on board prior to our appointment.
There may have been, but did it, at any time after Artelia's appointment into the project, did you ever give advice as to whether or not Studio E were competent?
Not me particularly, and I'm not sure what Keith Bushell advised the client when he came on board to the project
Right.
either.
We look at the word competent there. What was your understanding of the word competent?
The designers were competent in their profession.
How would Artelia normally go about assessing the competence of designers for the purposes of discharging their obligations under the CDM regulations and indeed under this part of the contract?
Specifically, I'm not sure because I'm not a CDM coordinator. That would be something that I would expect Keith Bushell to deal with.
Yes, but as a project director, you must have had some understanding of how it was that Artelia would go about discharging those obligations. I'm interested in what it was.
My expectation would be that it would look at the types of projects that they had been involved with, whether there had been any particular health and safety issues in relation to the work that they had done, whether there were any outstanding claims for negligence against them, and what their track record was in terms of performance and producing designs in relation to program and level of detail that they would produce, any feedback from other sort of sources as well, and their general health and safety record.
Right. I see. So if it turned out that Studio E had never done an overclad of a high-rise residential building before, would you still say that they were competent, given the definition that you've just given us?
Yes, because that wouldn't necessarily impact on their competency as designers.
Would it not?
No.
If they'd never had any experience in designing an overclad of a high-rise residential building, if they'd never done it before, why would that not impact on their competence? Can you help?
Because the project itself was not just overcladding, it was refurbishment and bringing up to standards. There were M&E enhancements that were being made. There were structural alterations being made at the bottom. There were landscaping changes. So the overcladding was just one part of the project, and therefore just saying that because they'd not done an overcladding project wouldn't necessarily say that they were incompetent.
I see. So you'd look at the question of competence in the round. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
And are you saying that even though, in fact, the particular architect, it needn't be Studio E, it could be any architect for the purposes of your understanding of the definition of competent, even though the particular architect might not have had experience at all of one element of the project, that might be outweighed by experience of others. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
I see. As a matter of fact, did that analysis that I've just articulated to you ever get done by Artelia in respect to Studio E?
I don't know.
Right. Can we go to page 63 of the contract? This is still in the CDMC Schedule of Services, and on the top half of the page, under generally, there's not much left in the rest of the page, admittedly, but it says generally, the second bullet point, work with the project team with a proactive approach to ensure that schemes are designed and delivered, incorporating all relevant requirements to achieve statutory compliance. What did you understand that to mean, do you think?
That basically, as a CDM coordinator, that they should be proactive in working with the design teams to ensure that their designs complied with whatever requirements would be necessary, with particular relation to the CDM regulations.
Statutory compliance means what it says. Did you understand that at the time, as a matter of fact, to have included the building regulations?
Yes, because as part of it would have been ensuring that there would have been a sign-off or a review of building regulations, but not necessarily looking at it in detail.
And in general terms, and I'm not talking about specifics at the moment, but what steps did Artelia take to satisfy itself that the Grenfell Tower scheme was compliant with all applicable statutory obligations, including the building regulations?
It wasn't part of our role to ensure compliance overall in terms of detail because we weren't responsible for design. It was ensuring that the design team were actually making sure that they were doing those things rather than actually looking at the detail of it.
I follow that. So you're accepting that your job wasn't to ensure compliance, but it was to ensure that the design team were making sure that they complied.
Correct.
And what would that supervisory or insurance role, as you expressed it, involve?
Well, at design team meetings, we would review progress and we would review what actions had been taken place in between the meetings,
Right.
and that what actions were still to be carried out to achieve a design that could be then submitted either for planning or that could be then used for preparation of tender documents, etc.
At design team meetings, would you review not only progress and actions, but also to do something to ensure that the designs themselves were compliant with the building regulations?
We wouldn't look at the detail of the compliance. We would ask the questions as to whether what progress had been made.
So your questions were limited actually to progress and to carrying out of actions which had been promised to be carried out at the last meeting.
Correct.
I see. Well, we may come back to that in due course. Can we just stick with this then? I just want to look at the use of the term designer in the CDM regulations next. Can we please go to page 34 in the contract? That's back to page 34. And on that page, we see at the bottom of the page, clause 4.2, CDM regulations, and we can see that there's a deletion of the part that says the consultant is not a designer for the purposes of the CDM regulations, and the part that says the consultant is a designer for the purposes of the CDM regulations is, as it were, ticked. You see that?
Yes, I do.
Now, we saw earlier, because I showed it to you on page 35, it's the next page, that Artelia was not contractually responsible for the design of the project. Do you want to see that again? It's page 35. It's probably just convenient to do that. Did you see that?
Yes, I do.
And just flipping back then to the page before, we can see here that even though Artelia was not contractually responsible for the design of the project, the consultant, Artelia, is a designer for the purposes of the CDM. Do you see the point I'm putting to you?
Yes, I do.
Thus far.
Yeah.
Now, you've addressed this in paragraph 38D of your third witness statement. Can we just have that up, please? It's page 17. And on page 17, you can see there that at paragraph 38D, at the bottom of the page, you say that my understanding is that as a technical matter, because AUK was involved in preparing a contract sum analysis and collating the employer's requirements, which are documents that refer to the designs produced by others on the project, AUK, that's Artelia UK, needed to be identified as a designer for the purposes of the CDM regulations in its appointment. AUK did not, however, produce any designs, just go over the page, itself on the project, and as I say, above had no responsibility for the design of the project. Indeed, this is something which Miss Williams appeared to accept in her email of the 20th of July 2015, see paragraph 15 above, in which she stated that Artelia are an unlikely designer. In my view, Miss Williams understood at the time that AUK had no design responsibility under its appointment. Now, we'll come back in due course to what happened in the summer of 2015 on this question. But can I just ask you, where you say Artelia didn't do any design work itself on the project, can you explain why Artelia should be a designer for CDM purposes?
Because at the time I understood that because we were producing documents that had cross-references to technical documents with specifications in, that we would have to be identified as a designer. I know that there are different views in that respect, and that since then I'm aware that actually we should not have been identified as a designer.
I see.
The CDM regulations.
So at the time, did you understand that there was a difference between a designer for the CDM regulations and a consultant who was responsible for the design of the project?
The CDM regulations have a definition of what they call a designer, which is not in particular relation to designing the full design for a building, an architectural design or an engineering design.
Right, I follow. So in summary, was it that you thought that you were a designer, not you personally, but Artelia was a designer within the definition of the CDM regulations, but as consultant, not actually responsible for design?
Correct.
I see. Mr. Chairman, it's 4:30.
Yes,
I'm going to turn to a subtopic it's probably as convenient at the moment as any.
Probably as good as any, yes, thank you. Well, Mr. Cash, I'm sorry, you're just getting into your stride, but we do finish the day at 4:30. I think for most of us it's long enough.
I'm
So
sure.
we're going to break at that point. We'll come back and resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
I will. Thank you.
And may I ask you, please, not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it overnight?
Yes, I'll make sure I don't.
Good, thank you very much. Right, would you like to go with the ushers then, please?
Thank you.
Right, Mr. Millett, that's it for the day, and we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.